Well, I just got out of the court behind me. Instead of a full day, it was a 4-hour hearing, technically called a judicial review. That is, the Canada Revenue Agency twice rejected Rebel News' application for this QCJO news license, and we asked the court to review it. Now, whenever a court reviews an expert panel and a tax panel, a journalism panel, these are granted some deference. You don't want the courts to overturn everything. The standard of review is often reasonableness. There's other standards like correctness and how much wiggle room will the court give the lower decision maker. And in this case, it seemed like the standard was reasonableness, as in they could be wrong but reasonable, you know what I mean? But our lawyers, Robert Hawks and Sarah Miller, I think were very strong at pointing out to the judge that the way the CRA handled this was completely unreasonable, claiming that that only 1 or 2% of our work was actual journalism. Let me give you an example of how they excluded our journalism, saying it wasn't real journalism. As you know, we sometimes interview people. I interview people on my show. We interview people on the street. Sometimes we interview sort of big shots on location. You might even remember I flew all the way to the Netherlands to interview Geert Wilders. So we do a fair bit of interviews. It's not our primary thing. Well, for some weird reason, all of our interviews were declared not original news content. Are you kidding me? Speaking of Geert Wilders, I was actually the first foreign journalist in the world to interview him after that groundbreaking election. That is, by definition, news in every sense of the word. But Trudeau's hand-picked journalism advisory panel said, no, that doesn't fall within the rules. That's not real journalism. And that's how they got the ridiculous number of 1 or 2% of our stuff being journalism. That's obviously an error. That one decision alone to say that none of our interviews are news is so bizarre and laughable. Well, laughable is the wrong word. It's kept us out of this news license for years. It was interesting. There was some good discussion in the court about freedom of the press, and our lawyer, in this case Robert Hawks, we had two lawyers in there, Hawks was talking about how Trudeau has had a vendetta against Rebel News and spent a fair bit of time in the two victorious court cases we had in the same building, by the way, the same federal court, when Trudeau's hand-picked henchmen kept us out of the leaders' debate. They were using the exact same ideas then. Oh, you're not real journalists. You engage in advocacy. You engage in opinion journalism. You crowdfund for things. Each of those criticisms was treated by the court when they tried to ban us from the leaders' debates. And in both cases, in 2019 and 2021, the judges weren't having it. One of the reasons was we were able to show that many journalistic organizations in Canada do those things. Advocacy, have you ever seen a newspaper that doesn't have an editorial and comment section? What's that but a fancy word for saying advocacy? And although it's not common, it is not unusual to see newspapers crowdfund. Even the CBC, they'll say, here's a story on these wildfires, here's how you could chip into the Red Cross. By the way, we did that exact same thing with the Fort McMurray wildfires, we used the Red Cross. So although the CRA hates us with a red-hot burning fire, judges who were not weren't handpicked by Trudeau for the mission of blocking us. I'm thinking that they'll find this whole thing a little bit weird. Like, it's a little bit weird, the amount of time and effort and money that Trudeau is putting into calling us not real journalists. It's sort of crazy.
I won't call it a media organization. Your group of individuals need to take accountability.
There were a few strategic decisions that our lawyers made that came out during this process. And it was certain things that we chose to argue or not to argue. And I won't get into the legal minutia, but one of the outcomes we did not want is to be sent back to the CRA for another internal review. What I mean by that is we applied to the CRA for this news license and we were rejected. So we reapplied and we were rejected. We don't want the court to say, well, they had some procedural screw-ups, do it a third time, because I can tell you right now, they're going to reject us as long as Trudeau's henchmen are in there. We want the court here to say, no, you guys have shown that you're not reasonable. Rebel News is obviously journalists. I mean, literally, what do they think we're doing all day? We have, at this moment in time, about 41 staff at Rebel News. If we're not doing journalism, what on earth are we doing? We're not covering sports. We're not covering, human interest stories. It's absolutely nuts to me. Listen, I am a tiny bit hopeful. I mean, it's always a long shot when you're doing a judicial review because, like I say, the courts allow decision makers to be wrong. They just have to be wrong in a reasonable way. So what we have actually a pretty high burden that we have to overcome. But I'm a little bit optimistic because I think the judge is fair or fair enough. I think the government lawyers were not particularly the sharpest knives in the drawer, no offense. And I think our lawyers were great. But more importantly than the people involved are the facts and the law. It is an obvious fact that Rebel News produces news. It's in our name. And you don't have to trust me. You can see for yourselves. Certainly other media consider us news. They hate us because we disagree with them, but that doesn't mean we're not news. I think the facts and the law are on our side, and I think that any fair judge would see that. And I'm hoping that the fact that the whole world has fallen out of love with Justin Trudeau, including here in downtown Toronto, will mean that even Toronto judges in the federal court are a little bit sick of Trudeau weaponizing the entire bureaucracy to scratch his own itches. I sure hope so. Listen, I have not seen the legal bill we're going to get for today. Like I say, we had two excellent lawyers in there. I'm not going to tell you how much they are per hour, but it's a lot of money. Trudeau, on the other hand, used tax dollars to pay for his lawyers. Obviously, they're from the Attorney General's office. If you can help me cover the bill, today alone, I don't even want to get, there's just no way today was less than $20,000. There's just no way. Please go to wearesuingtrudeau.com. And let me close on that note. We are suing Trudeau. We were in a court that had 60 occupancy, 60. There were rows of chairs. I was the only guy in there. There were our lawyers and the Justice Department lawyers. There were two clerks and there was a judge. And it was a big, beautiful courtroom. Right downtown Toronto, easy to get to, subway line here, everything. I was alone. No one else was there. No one else cared. And by no one, I mean no. Hey, thanks very much. Look at that. That's friendly, eh? No one else was in there. No other journalistic groups, no other media companies saying, look, we might not like the cut of Rebel's jib, but if they can be banned today, we can be banned tomorrow. If the government can tell us who's a journalist, in the case of Rebel News, they can tell us who's a journalist at the Globe and Mail, the National Post, or the Toronto Sun. Why were they not there? I remember when I was a young man in law school, reading these great cases about freedom of the press. I think I told you this story before. That all the media companies would get together and each one would chip in like $1,000. So you had Global News and CTV and the CBC even, and Toronto Star, and everyone would chip in $1,000, and they'd get like 20 grand, and they'd hire an excellent free speech lawyer. And that free speech lawyer would go and seek intervener status and say, Your Honor, we're here on behalf of all these TV stations, radio stations, newspapers, and we're here to make the case for freedom of the press. And it did two things. First of all, it said to the judge, this is a big case you're dealing with. It might have one person's name on it, but it affects freedom for everyone. So the judge would pay attention and say, oh, there's a lot of people whose situation depends on this. And second of all, when you got 20 people hiring a lawyer together, it spreads the pain around. Don't tell me the Star, the Sun, the Post can't afford to chip in $1,000 each to get a great lawyer. So it would make sure that all the arguments were fully exercised. And it would make sure the judge knew that this was an important case. Whatever happened to that? That used to happen all the time. It has never happened in the cases we're fighting. I was in the same building fighting for my rights for the book, The Libranos. I was alone. I was in there today fighting for Rebel News. I was alone. And I think Canada is weaker in terms of civil society. And maybe they don't like me, and maybe they don't like Rebel News, and that's fine, that's fair. But what's that got to do with the precedent? See, an important thing is going to come from this court case one way or another. If Rebel News wins, hopefully, we demolished Trudeau's censorship regime for journalists. That's an enormous win for the whole country and for ordinary people, not just journalists. But God forbid if we lose, what a terrible precedent that sets on the other side. Don't you think a lot turns on this? I sure do. I always tell our team that we do two special things that other conservative media don't. We're on the ground with cameras showing you what's really happening. We're on the scene, not just in Canada, but sometimes even overseas. We go to where it happens. That's one of the things that makes us different. We're not just giving our opinion in front of a studio. But the second thing we do is every now and then we stop and we fight. Every now and then we stop and we try and make a difference because no one else will. We fill the gap. Hey, can you help me on this one? Chip in a few bucks if you can to wearesuingtrudeau.com.